and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent advancements in science and technology, the people and ideas that make them possible, and the ways in which they enhance human flourishing. I'm Thomas Walker.
And I'm Angelica Worth, and we're going to start today out by talking about Mercedes-Benz's new concept car called Vision AVTR. And the cool thing about this car is that it is partially controlled by your brain. Yeah, so they unveiled the totality of this concept car at IAA Mobility Show in Munich very recently. And I say the totality of it because the design was actually unveiled last year in January 2020 at the CES 2020 show in Las Vegas. And the car, as I mentioned, is called the AVTR, which technically stands for Advanced Vehicle Transformation. But it's also a nod to the 2009 movie Avatar, directed by James Cameron, who actually introduced the car at CES in Las Vegas. So this is a really cool example of, innovations being inspired by art. And part of that inspiration is the design, which Mercedes-Benz worked on it in collaboration with Disney. Disney has a history of looking forward and of innovations, although most of them have been in entertainment and marketing. If you want to hear more about that, check out our sister show, The Hero Show. They have an episode a couple weeks ago on Walt Disney and his innovations. But what Cameron helped unveil was the design for the car. At that point, the car still had a steering wheel. The new concept has no steering wheel, no buttons, no dials, nothing. There's one thing that you touch for control, which is on the center console. You put your hand on, that's how you accelerate, turn, stop, etc. And then the rest of the controls are controlled by you looking at things on the display and the activity in your brain, which you wear a headset so it can pick up on that activity. This is called a brain-computer interface. Sorry?
To say, what is the avatar interface? Because what you're describing there, your sort of control ball, sounds like the controls in Stargate SG-1 on the gold ships. They have this sort of half dome that you just move your hands around to fly the ships.
Yeah, so it's kind of like that. And the avatar connection, besides that they wanted it to have a very biology-inspired look, which you can really see in Mercedes-Benz's video on it, which we'll link in the description. It's like a minute and a half to show off the concept, really. But they wanted it to be a very intuitive control for your transport, sort of like in the Avatar movie, where they connect to the flying creatures and then are able to ride them that way. So the idea is you connect, in this case, by putting on the headset, which has to kind of calibrate to your brain activity for a few minutes before you can go. And then it should be very, very intuitive, sort of like a live animal. The control thing actually pulses as though it has a heartbeat.
I'm sure some horse riders will take issue with the idea that it's very simple and intuitive to learn to ride an animal.
I'm sure it's not. Yeah, I've ridden horses a little bit. It's not that intuitive, but yeah. So it's a very fascinating concept and very interesting step forward in technology. As I said, it's a concept car, so they do have a prototype you can drive, but they don't expect it to be ready for market for in the next couple of years. But the technology does exist. It is drivable. Some other features of this car: it has a rechargeable electric battery made from recyclable materials, and unlike a lot of the current electric cars that take a long time to charge, this one fully charges in 15 minutes. Which, having had the great pleasure of borrowing a Tesla, we understand that most of them do not charge that quickly.
No, it depends on what if you plug them into fast chargers or not. But yeah, that took me like a whole day to charge that sometimes, and then the faster you charge them, sometimes it degrades the battery life as well over time.
Mm-hmm. And then this car can also angle its wheels such that it drives almost directly sideways, kind of like the crab.
My next sci-fi reference will be Minority Report, where the cars go up the sides of the walls and drive sideways and then go onto the freeway. I think that's the future we're moving towards.
Exactly. So more mobility, which could help avoid accidents, obviously, and help in tight situations. I would be remiss to talk about brain-controlled technology, though, without bringing up Neuralink, which is one of Elon Musk's many initiatives. Neuralink, though, has one key difference from the technology the Mercedes-Benz is using, in that the Neuralink device is actually an implant that gets stuck in your brain. and that you use to control a variety of technology. And it is intended, at least at first, as a medical device to help people who are paralyzed or disabled be able to communicate and control technology better. But they have tested it in animals so far, particularly on a monkey and a pig. Those tests have gone well. And the last update I could find is from April, and they were saying that they were hoping to start testing on people later this year in 2021.
It's exciting, although concerning in some of the potential implications. Whereas in the car, it sounds like you just focus on a specific point, and that's how you.
Yeah. Yeah, there were some concerns I was finding, I think probably valid concerns regarding the Neuralink about, it being hacked, security concerns, safety concerns, obviously. So, and that one also, though, like I said, it's intended as a medical device. They hope to make it available to healthy people at some point, but that point probably won't be for a good 10 years or so. But yeah, the advantages of the Vision AVTR car, besides, like we were talking about, helping you out in tight spaces with the sideways driving, the actual interface and the lack of pedals and things makes it more accessible for people who are disabled or paralyzed to be able to drive. And it's just a huge step forward in technology being controlled by your brain, which will hopefully bring us, greater efficiency. But there are still some questions about this technology. That's why it's not quite ready for market yet. Do you have a question, dear?
I was going to say, you were talking about the interface. I think you told me earlier that it's like the screen covers the entire dashboard.
Yeah. So the actual interface that you look at just covers the whole front of the car in one smooth panel. And most of the time, the default is to show the road ahead, but you can adjust it to be showing other things, again, just by looking at different points.
It's like the front of the car is transparent. You can see what's...
Well, the doors are actually entirely transparent.
Oh, wow.
And then there's that additional footage. Yeah, so it's quite cool.
That was always a problem when we had the Tesla, is you got that sort of almost giant phone screen between the two front seats. But if you've got anything up on that menu, then you can't see the map or whatever else you could have on the screen. You can only have one thing on the screen at a time. And then you're always looking down here instead of at the road.
Well, that's one of the concerns with this car still is, can you control it by directing your gaze to the particular point on the display and not lose focus on the road? And they haven't done the testing to determine that yet. So that's one of the concerns. The reliability of this technology hasn't really been tested yet. So there are still a lot of questions before it gets ready to go to market, but it's still a huge step forward and very exciting.
Awesome. So seeing as you've kind of done the technology thing this week, I'll do the medical one. Just this is how it happened in the course of our research. We ended up switching our roles, and I've come up with the medical item this time. But this was quite interesting to me because it's something that's affected people in my family. It's a new potential treatment for osteoarthritis, which is there are two main forms of arthritis that you regularly encounter, which is osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. And rheumatoid arthritis, some of my relatives have had to deal with, and that's where you have like kind of hot pain in your joints. But osteoarthritis is without the sensation of heat, and it's caused by a breakdown of cartilage, the soft material that sits in between your bones and your joints, and it causes the bones to rub together, and over time it causes a lot of pain and discomfort and a gradual loss of joint function. And osteoarthritis is the most common form of arthritis, and it affects 8.3 million people in the UK, 30 to 50 million in the US. So, both of those figures, it's round about more than 10% of the population, really. And it is actually, both of those figures are over 10% of the population. So, there's a hell of a lot of people, and it's mostly older people. So again, if you think about those figures, that's much larger proportion of elderly people. Most elderly people really at some point, depending how long they live for. And but it's not exclusively an old person's condition. So some people have bone alignment problems from birth or that manifest later that can lead to osteoarthritis as well in younger people, and we'll come back to that. At the moment, there's really not a lot available in terms of treatments for osteoarthritis. So the simplest treatment is stay active and exercise more, which just reduces the chance of it happening or reduces the progression of it as if it does happen. Also, maintaining a healthy weight is important. People who are overweight are going to be far more subject to it because there's far more pressure going on those hip and knee joints. Knees are the most common place for it to manifest, because that constant movement means that the cartilage never has time to regrow. And then the hips, same situation really. It's just, it's an area you can't really rest. You're just always moving and you're always putting weight on it. It can happen in any joint in the body. It can happen in your shoulders, elbows, whatever, but hips, knees, hips, and then finger joints and spine, the most common in that order, pretty much. So as I say, there's very little in the way of treatment at the moment. So apart from just exercising, a lot of it is just pain relief. People will just be prescribed painkillers for it. And then when it gets to a point of needing intervention, there's a couple of treatments, injecting steroids into the joints or injecting blood plasma into the joints. There's a couple of other things along those lines. But if it gets to a serious enough point, then the only real option is to outright replace the joint with an artificial joint. Cool that we can do that, but not an ideal thing to need to resort to.
It's quite expensive and invasive, takes a long time to recover from.
Yeah. And I've heard older people just joke about needing or having a new hip done, like it's just take off the wheel and put on a new one. But it's it's obviously a hell of a lot harder than that, and respect to people who play it down in that kind of way. But so at the moment, very little in the way of options. This treatment, which has been progressed by a team working at Basel University in Switzerland, led by Ivan Martin. And this is based on using cells from the nasal septum. So that's the bridge in the middle of your nose between your two nostrils. And the cells the cells that the team are using there, even though they're on the front of your nose, they actually come from the back of your head when you're a fetus, and they just kind of end up in other parts of the body, but they're actually cells from the base of the spine, the neuroectoderm, which is sort of not base of the spine, base of the brain, top of the spine. And I'll just read a little quote from Ivan Martin explaining why those cells are particularly useful. He says, unlike the cartilage tissue in the joints, these cartilage cells originate from precursor cells of the neuroectoderm. They therefore have a distinct regenerative and adaptive capacity, or plasticity. Tissue grown from nasal cartilage cells seems also to retain these special properties. So it's whereas most cartilage cells don't have that regrowth capability, those ones from the ectoderm and from the nasal cartilage as well do. So injecting those into the joints encourages the cartilage to regrow. And he's not just taking the cells and injecting them as they are, they're taking them and then growing cultured cells in a lab from those cells. So some impressive technology going on here as well. I forgot to mention, by the way, that Basel University is a private university, so this is an entirely private innovation as well. One
of the top universities in Europe, from what I understand.
Yes, that's up some stiff competition as well. So they initially tested this in mice and then in sheep. So they were taking the nasal septum cells and putting them into arthritic joints in sheep. As anyone who's had an older dog knows, lots of animals suffer from arthritis as well.
We had a German Shepherd when I was younger who had some arthritis and hip dysplasia in her back hips, which made it really hard for her to walk.
Yeah, I see it a lot in German Shepherds and larger dogs like that, Great Danes, and the sort of back legs will just bow down after a while from it, and it's hard for them to walk. That was an initial testing phase, and then they moved on to testing on a couple of human subjects. These were both younger people who had the bone alignment issues I was describing earlier, and they injected both of them. And unfortunately, one of them, this happened right at the start of the COVID outbreak, and one of them was not able to come back and be followed up on because of all the COVID restrictions. So he was just reporting remotely, but his reports were that his situation got a lot better. The other one, who was expected to require a joint replacement fairly soon, the regrowth has been enough that they're not expecting that to be necessary now for a few years at least. So it's pushed back the need for that joint replacement. It shows encouraging signs of regrowth. So limited, pool of data to draw on at the moment, because basically only 2 human tests and then some animal ones, which have all shown some really promising results. Because prior to now, it's really just manage. There's never been a repair option, and you can't repair the bone damage that arthritis causes. But regrowing that cartilage, to be able to do that more would just be fantastic for quality of life in older people, because as assuming that humanity continues to progress with the kind of philosophy that we extol on this show, then hopefully life expectancy will get longer in the coming years, and deaths from other causes that affect elderly people a lot, cancers and heart disease and that kind of thing, will go down. So this is one of the big things. It's not a big killer in the way those things are, but it's a massive destroyer of quality of life for older people. So if we can improve that quality of life for people who reach those ages, then that's a wonderful thing, and they get more useful lifespan where they can walk and not be in discomfort all the time. So the human flourishing benefit is very obvious in this case. But as always with these medical innovations, there's a proper testing process to go through, and that's now hopefully going to begin in the coming years. So we're still probably looking at 3 to 5 years before it's widely available, because it needs to go through that whole process of
and then the regulatory process after that.
And as I've said before, I'd rather people who are in the situation of needing it just have the choice whether they take the risk or not. But we're in a situation where, unfortunately, it's probably going to be half a decade before the people who need it can get it, and some of the people who need it won't get it in time. But it is what it is, unfortunately. And I'm just glad that there's people out there doing these things, and hopefully quality of life for older people and for other people who have again, remember that it's not just an old person's disease, will get a lot better in the coming years.
Absolutely. So moving on from that, we've got our honorable mentions for this week. And I'm going to start with another example of something we've talked about on this show before, which is biomimicry, where scientists look at the way something's working in the natural world for animals, and try to mimic it in our technology to make it useful for humans.
Like your elephant trunk limb.
Yes, like the elephant trunk robot arms. Yeah. In this case, the work isn't quite as advanced yet. They haven't actually put it into practice, but I'm going to tell you how they're trying to. So in this case, rather than elephant trunks, the example in nature is ant teeth. And it's got applications for engineering.
Ants have teeth.
Ants have teeth on their little pinchers on the mandibles.
Oof.
That's how like a fire ant bites you, for example.
Horrid.
And so there are a group of researchers, actually a biophysicist and his team, and then a material scientist and his team, that have figured out how ants are able to cut through so much, given that they're very small and not very strong. So specifically, the biophysicist's name is Robert Schofield, and he's at the University of Oregon. And the materials research scientist, he's a senior research material scientist at the U.S. Department of Energy Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Quite a mouthful. But his name is Arun Devaraj, and he's got a doctoral intern, Xiaoyu Wang, who's been helping him in this work. And so what they found in the ant's teeth is that the ant's teeth are infused with zinc. Very small amount. It's like 8% of the tooth's weight. But what's most interesting is not that the zinc is there, but that it is very thinly spread in a very even way throughout the teeth, which is where the material science part comes in, because they use techniques that they would normally use to assess a material. Specifically, the technique is called atom probe tomography, to figure out exactly where those atoms were spaced. But the benefit of that thin, even spread is that the ants are able to use 60% of the energy that they would have needed if they didn't have the metal, if their teeth were made out of solely out of a calcium-based material, like a lot of the hard structures in animals. And so very excited by these possibilities, the scientists are moving on to study similar structures in scorpion stings and spider fangs to see if they also work the same way.
What is the implementation of?
So the idea is to apply this to engineering. This is what Devaraj is now moving on to trying to do. His point is, if we can figure out how to infuse metal structure or metal such as zinc into other structures in that small thin amount, we very cheaply get a way to make things stronger, more efficient, and more durable. And in his own words, he says, by studying steel microstructure also at the atomic scale, we can better understand how altering the composition of materials changes its damage resistance, specifically stress corrosion resistance and behavior over time. This is especially important for designing structures like nuclear power plants that need to withstand aging for many decades. So as we've talked about on the show before, nuclear power plants are a fantastic option for producing energy in the future, but they do need to be built properly. And if we can, infuse structures with zinc in a very thin, even way, and that will help their durability and strength, then, that's a fantastic option. And I'm sure there are more applications in engineering, but the idea is using a small amount of metal to make something significantly stronger.
Awesome. That sounds very, very exciting.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to move on to another aviation innovation, because I've talked a few times now about various different electric aircraft projects. And this is another of those, but I don't want to talk about the environmental aspect of it this time, because this is a development by a company called Regent, and they're bringing back an old idea, which is the flying boat or the seaplane. And anyone who's been on, I've actually not myself, but anyone who's been on a modern seaplane, they're generally just like a little Cessna with pontoons on it that, they're often used for hopping around islands in places like the Maldives or the Seychelles. They have military applications way back then during what we in Britain called the war, or the Second World War, I think, in countries where it wasn't as a big deal.
It's not that it wasn't a big deal. It's just that there was another one that was a similarly big deal not that long before it.
Yeah, for everyone's benefit, I used the term the war when we were rehearsing this, and you were like, which war? It's like in Britain there's just the war. But no, so during the Second World War, the flying boats were used in a military capacity, and these were larger aircraft that had curved underbellies, so they literally landed on the water, and then floated like large boats. There's been a few different sort of boat plane hybrids at different points in time. Russians came up with this crazy thing called the ekranoplan, which is just like a plane that flies. Ekranoplan.
Ekranoplan, okay.
Yeah, which is like a plane that flies directly above the water and uses the ground effect to stay in the air. And then you also get things called hydrofoils, which are boats with wings under them, which travel at a certain speed and lift up out of the water. I went on one of those in Hong Kong. It was amazing. You just fly across the water at insane speed.
That sounds fun.
It is. But these are flying boats in the same sense of sort of the Second World War ones, where it's a larger aircraft, 6-engine, 3 on each wing, passenger plane that floats on its underbelly in the water, but it also has a hydrofoil under it as well. So it's a combination of these things, and the idea being that it lands in the sea and then zooms on the hydrofoil up to the edge of the city. And the advantage there is that if you're taking a flight from, say, San Diego to San Francisco, then instead of driving all the way out to the airport or taking whatever transport you get out to the airport, and then use security rubbish and all that stuff, and then you fly over and then all the way back into the city again, you get more of that city center to city center connectivity. And it's a 180-mile-an-hour aircraft, so it's not rocketing along at 550 like passenger jets do. But again, you're cutting out all that extra delay time. So it has this application of connecting coastal communities together. It's not much use if you live away from a coast, but in an American context, all those West Coast, East Coast cities and the ones that are on the lakes in the middle, there's that potential to connect those smaller cities that don't have the great, big airports, places like Milwaukee, where we were a few weeks ago, that, could benefit a lot from having that direct link to all those other major coastal cities and those smaller towns in between.
And it's faster than a ferry, isn't it?
Significantly, yeah. So a traditional ferry is just deathly slow. I've taken the one from Dover to Calais enough times, and you're on it for like an hour and a half to go a distance that the train does in 10 minutes in the tunnel. There's other things like hovercraft and catamarans that can do it quicker, and the things I already talked about. But if you can get in the air and lose all of that water resistance, then that's just infinitely better. And the exciting thing about this is that direct service to the city center by aircraft is quite cool. And I wanted to give a quick mention also to another company called Archer, who are developing an aircraft for a similar role, but this is a vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL aircraft, which might conjure up images of Harrier jump jets and F-16s and planes like F-35s, planes like that, military jets that have the engines that can swivel to a vertical position and land like a helicopter. But this is a bit more like a tilt rotor. It's like, which are the helicopters with two rotors that can then rotate forwards and fly forwards like a plane. And so, that gives you, again, that direct into the city center option, not just for coastal cities, but then you do have the issue of, if something that's basically a helicopter is landing in the city center all the time, there's a noise concern there.
Sure, yeah.
So I think the seaplane route actually probably has a bit more mileage in it, but they're both interesting ideas. And that later one reminds me a bit of the Virgin Air Taxi I was talking about way back in the second episode, but on a larger scale. So there's just so many interesting aviation and advancements. It's such a under attack sector, but it's actually promising all sorts of interesting new ways to connect people that I can't wait to try out.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. So moving on, I'm going to be talking about the a really interesting way to advance the fight against cancer. So in this case, they're actually using mRNA vaccines combined with immunotherapy to get rid of cancer. So mRNA vaccines, as compared to have been in the news a lot really recently, because Pfizer and Moderna's COVID vaccines are mRNA vaccines. So just to quickly explain the difference between those and the conventional vaccines we've been using, conventional vaccines contain a dead or weakened strain of the pathogen itself, so as to teach your body's immune system how to identify it so it can destroy it should you come in contact with it. mRNA vaccines sort of skip a step because they don't use the pathogen. They give your body the instructions, your cells the instructions to make part of the pathogen itself for your body to then learn how to fend off. mRNA, if you remember, is a messenger ribonucleic acid. So it's what sends the message to cells to make something. So there's a lot of challenges with mRNA vaccines. For example, your body doesn't readily accept foreign mRNA. It's like getting instructions from somebody who's not your boss. Like, you sit there like, what am I supposed to do with this?
I don't take orders from you. Yeah.
Right. But there's been a lot of work done on that in the last 5 years that Pfizer and Moderna took advantage of to get their vaccine done so quickly. And so now they're experimenting with non-infectious diseases like cancer. And there are a number of trials in progress, mostly in phase 1 and phase 2 at this point, for at least 6 different types of cancer. And as such, there are a number of organizations involved with the research, including the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston and the University of Arizona Cancer Center. But basically, the whole concept is you use one of these mRNA vaccines combined with immunotherapy, which is a type of drug that's meant to either enhance or suppress your immune system. I think in this case, it's enhanced, but there are some times where you need to get your immune system to dial back if it's going to respond to the medicine poorly.
Overzealous security.
It's overzealous security, exactly. If any of your, what's the word I want? Transplant patients, like my uncle, then you end up, that's an example where you need to shut down the immune system because your body will reject the foreign material, even though it's keeping you alive.
So here is the mRNA kind of trying to program the cells to not metastasate and so in this case it's teaching your immune systems to attack the tumor actually. Right. And so some of these are general vaccines, but possibly the more interesting ones, or at least they're more interesting in my opinion, are the personalized ones. And so rather than having a pre-designed vaccine, what the doctors do is they take from the patient, they take some healthy tissue and they take some tumor tissue, and then they analyze the DNA and find the discrepancy. So they find the mutation that caused the tumor, which obviously building on the work of the Human Genome Project and all the genome sequencing to be able to do this. But then they build a vaccine, an mRNA vaccine based off that mutation specifically. And this process takes like 4 to 8 weeks. It's not that long.
And the advantage, one advantage of this, besides the fact that it's, super specifically targeted, is you don't actually have to have the type of cancer or the stage of cancer even diagnosed for this to work, because it's not, for leukemia, it's for your specific mutation. So that's super helpful. And as I said, these trials are pretty early on. So far, they're finding that it works really well for some type of cancers, not so well for others. And there are researchers who are still working on different ways to improve like how the mRNA actually gets to where it needs to be, because otherwise the body will destroy it before it's done its job. They're experimenting with different immunotherapies to combine it with and a few other factors. But so this research is fairly early on, but it has had some success in taking care of some particularly stubborn cases that I was reading about of cancer. So very exciting.
That's excellent. Yeah. Ties into what I was saying earlier about extending lifespans.
Yes, and improving quality of life, because even people who
Yeah.
survive cancer often deal with side effects from chemotherapy. Again, my uncle dealt with that.
So did my dad. Yeah.
Yeah, and just, so did your dad. Yeah, horrible quality of life for a couple of years, if not longer.
Yeah. So on to somewhat more upbeat subject. I'm going to move into my favorite field of science, which is astronomy, and but also use it to make an interesting point about the scientific method, I think, which is about how to do science, which is talking about extrasolar planets. So to explain for anyone who doesn't know, extrasolar planets are just planets that orbit stars other than the sun. So everyone, I hope you know what the structure of our solar system is. You have the sun at the center and the planets around it. Zoom out to the point that all of the planetary orbits are like this tiny, and the distances between solar systems are just enormous, like orders of magnitude bigger than any of the distances within our solar system. So seeing planets around other stars was, until the 90s, just completely impossible. We just did not have the technology to resolve objects that small, that far away. A star is just a point of light, and try and get things that are so close to it that they're just blinded out by that light, and they're so small that we don't have a telescope that can see them. It was just impossible. But there was always a sense that other stars probably have planets too. Why would our sun be the only one? It just doesn't make any sense. So but then in the 90s they started to discover extrasolar planets, mostly by indirect methods. So when a large planet passes in front of a star, it blocks part of the light from the star. So the star's light appears to dim and go up again.
It's the same idea of like if we have a solar eclipse where the moon passes in front of it.
Yeah, except it's not blocking the entire star. It's just,
right.
Because stars are huge, and even really big planets are tiny compared to stars. So it's more like if just like a little rock went in front of the sun from like at the distance of the moon. But
okay.
Yeah. But you can detect that dip in brightness, and if that's happening on a regular pattern, then something's orbiting the star. But that only really works when you have really large planets that are really close to their parent stars. So the first extrasolar planets that we were discovering were all that. They were all huge Jupiter-sized planets that are closer to their stars than Mercury is to our sun. So these were very different solar systems to our solar system. And another method they were finding planets by was if the star was wobbling from side to side, that suggested that a planet was actually pulling it off axis as it was. Now
sure, the effect of the gravity on it.
Yeah, and any planet orbiting a star does that to the star, but usually it's just such a tiny movement that you're not going to see it. But if it was significantly moving, then you knew there was a big heavy planet pulling it off axis. But again, that was only picking up those huge planets. So for a long time, the conclusion was, hang on, our solar system's an odd one out. It seems that most solar systems in the galaxy are a complete, the gas giants aren't way out beyond the rocky planets like they are here. They're right in next to the star. Why is our one the weird one? Of course, there was an old issue of sample bias going on there, because we were using methods that were primed to detect big planets close to the star. So naturally, that's what we were finding. And as technology has got better and better, we've started to find smaller and smaller planets that are further out from the stars, because we have other methods of doing it. One recent method that's come along very recently, because gravitational waves is a discovery that's only been made in the last half decade or so, is gravitational microlensing. And so that's it's not actually, I shouldn't have said that. It's not really connected to gravitational waves directly. It's an Einstein relativity thing. So when a planet passes in front of a star, rather than just directly blocking the light, it's the gravitational field of the planet distorts the light. So detecting that, and so the discovery recently that I'm sort of directly reporting on, I took a long-winded way of getting to it this time, but the discovery is that there are a lot more what they call cold planets, which is the equivalent of Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in our solar system. So gas giants or ice giants that are so far out that they're freezing cold. And Uranus and Neptune are smaller than Jupiter and Saturn. So there's more planets like that in other solar systems than until recently we thought. And I think as more discoveries go on, we're going to find that there's a large diversity of different structures of solar systems, but the structure we have in our solar system isn't as unusual as we might have thought. And there's all the same types of planets we have here everywhere else, and some others like the hot Jupiters as well that we don't have here, and super Earths, solid planets that are 2-3 times the size of Earth. So I find that just super exciting to imagine all these different kinds of worlds there are. But the moral of the story is don't draw conclusions on half of the evidence, and bear in mind the methods you're using to find something will impact the kind of finding you make. So it's just and I think generally when you're dealing with something like astronomy, where you have a limited access to information directly, to sort of assume that everything's like what you already see. So the assumption now is, okay, there's a lot more of these planets than we thought, and the models that we have of galactic formation suggest that should be even throughout the whole galaxy. They're saying even in the center of the galaxy. So as with any model, that's a guess. Don't know for sure until you can directly observe. But in astronomy, you have a situation where you can only observe a small proportion of things. Even with those methods I was talking about, transit methods, the planet has to pass between you and the star. If the orbit's like this, then you're not going to see it, or if it's like that, it has to be on that exact angle that it passes in front. So you're only ever dealing with a small percentage of what's actually out there. And the best thing we can do is keep developing more methods of detecting. But in the meantime, it's just that old modesty thing again of just, appreciate the fact that your pool of evidence is limited and the ability to draw conclusions from it is similarly limited.
Which is not to say that you shouldn't trust the evidence that you have, just, understand its limitations and always put the evidence before the models, like we've talked about on this show before.
What you see is there. It's just when you start drawing conclusions about what's most common or what's everywhere else based on that, when you're still at a very early stage of even being able to detect these things, is a jumping the gun a bit. And I think some scientific gun jumping goes on sometimes in these fields.
Sure. Well, I think that's all we had for today. So thank you so much for joining us on Innovation Celebration. Today we talked about Mercedes-Benz's Vision AVTR car and its brain-controlled technology. And then you talked about a new treatment for osteoarthritis using the patient's own cells from their nose.
Yeah, and then you went on and talked about horrible little ant teeth, which I don't want to think about too much. And their use in engineering. I talked about a couple different new proposals for city-to-city air travel. And then you talked about using mRNA vaccines to fight cancer. And I finished off by talking about cold planets being more common in the galaxy than was initially thought. So
lots of exciting advancements for human flourishing.
As we always try to find. Yes, we've managed to find 6 new things every week or more on some weeks. So there's a lot going on out there. And I'm glad to be able to bring that to people. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.